So let's move to our first presenter for today. Our first speaker is Dr. Tessa Conroy, Assistant Professor at the University of Wisconsin Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics, and also she is an Economic Development Specialist with UW Extension. Dr. Conroy's research focuses on Wisconsin's economic development and labor market, entrepreneurship, and business climate. As an extension specialist, she produces reports, briefs, and fact sheets on Wisconsin's economy, job creation, and the education pipeline. Dr. Conroy earned her PhD in economics from Colorado State University, and during her graduate studies also worked for the Congressional Research Service and Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. Dr. Conroy became interested in workforce development as a result of growing up in a very small rural town in Washington. No movie theaters, no stoplights. Sounds like Mosinee, where I grew up. A large portion of the town was employed at an aluminum plant that at one point provided over 1,000 jobs. When the plant closed in the early 2000s, like so many rural communities, her hometown continued to struggle after losing its major employer. And seeing this firsthand led her to focus on economic development, particularly on the role of new and small businesses in economic growth and performance. Today, she will discuss labor market trends in Wisconsin.
All right, good morning, everybody, and thanks to our host for bringing us all together. Today I'll be talking about labor market trends in Wisconsin. So there's been a lot of buzz, is my sense, in the state about a labor shortage, but as well as this potential skills gap or skills mismatch. And I just want to give some specificity to those particular topics and think about what is the data showing us, again, in relation to the labor market. So I think the big question is there a labor shortage? I'm going to show you some evidence today that I wouldn't say that there's an immediate and pressing crisis, but there is a pretty tight labor market based on the data that I'm looking at. And when we talk about a shortage, I want to be sure that we're clear that we're talking about a quantity issue. But when it comes to the labor market, we need to think about more than just quantity. It's not enough just to have enough workers. They also need to be appropriately skilled and in the right location for our employers. So there's also potential that we have a quality issue or spatial issue, and these things can look kind of like a shortage, and that might be part of why we're hearing about employers who are having trouble finding workers. So the first graph I'm showing is the unemployment rate in Wisconsin as well as the United States, just for comparison. The United States is in the dotted lines and then Wisconsin in the solid. I'm also showing two different measures of the unemployment rate. On the bottom, we have what we call U1. That's what you see in the news. That's the most commonly reported statistic for unemployment. And this is what we think of when we think of unemployment. These are people who do not have a job but would like to have one and are actively looking. U6 is an alternative measure of unemployment, and basically it's a more inclusive definition. We're not including just people who are unemployed and looking. We're also including people who would like to have a job but have perhaps become discouraged by their economic prospects, so they've stopped looking. These are people who are maybe underemployed. They would like to be working more hours or something to that effect. So I include both just to give a more holistic picture of what the unemployment landscape is looking like. And it's still the case that we have pretty low unemployment. Low in terms of it's about as low as it's been historically in the last 20 or 30 years. But it's not unusual, I would say, for an expansionary period. The economy's been growing now for several years, so I would say that this is consistent with what we've seen in Wisconsin before when things are growing and going well. This is the ratio of unemployed workers to job openings. This is only available by region. It's not available at the state level, so I'm showing this for the Midwest region. And basically what I'm showing you here is that, for example, during the recession, so in the peak kind of 2009, 2010, we had almost 8 unemployed workers for every job opening. So that means employers basically had their pick. They had these huge pools of unused labor that they could go into to hire their workers, lots of slack in the labor market. And that's come down. That's come down to actually just about 1 unemployed worker per job opening. So to me, that says a pretty considerably tight labor market, that there's just not huge pools of available labor for workers to hire from. And I think that this signals also a change in expectations, that for a long time, because employers had so many applicants or had such a large pool of labor, I can see where maybe you got used to that, and over time, that's gone away. So we don't have as many to choose from when it comes to hiring new workers. So is there a labor shortage? There are two particular data points that I look at when I try to answer that question. The first one is average hours worked. This is average weekly hours worked. And basically the idea here is that if there is a labor shortage, if employers are not able to find workers that they need, they're going to ask or even require the workers they do have to work more hours. So we should be seeing, if there is a labor shortage, we should be seeing increases in average weekly hours worked. So again, in 2009, we saw that dip during the recession and has consistently climbed up since then as expected. So average weekly hours worked is high. It's higher than it was in those years preceding the recession. I only go back to 2007 because that's as soon as the data set started. But it actually peaked in 2014 and has come down slightly since then. So I would say average weekly hours are high but stable. We're not seeing a lot of pressure and continual increases in average weekly hours worked that I would say are symptomatic of a severe and kind of immediate labor shortage. But high and stable. So again, kind of a pretty tight labor market, I would say. The other thing we would expect to see if there was a labor shortage is wage growth. So the labor market, like any other market, when something is in short supply, we expect that those people who are selling the good in short supply should be able to command a higher price. Workers selling their labor, if there is a shortage, should be able to command a higher price for their labor. So what we're seeing is some pressure on wage growth. But we should see over time wages grow somewhat, so some growth is expected. And this is relative to 2001, so this is kind of a longer term perspective. The last data point, the last quarter, is the second quarter of 2017, is still considered preliminary data. This is from the quarterly census of employment and wages, which is kind of the, flagship data set for wages. So I would say wages are increasing moderately, but I'm not seeing, again, this kind of immediate and severe pressure of a labor shortage. So we're seeing some growth. I think we could see some more when the data comes out for the last 2 quarters of 2017. In fact, there's an alternative data source that releases data more timely, so the last quarter of 2017 is out, and we are seeing that higher wage growth. So it could be the case, again, that we're starting to see the kind of pressure in the labor market build. We're starting to see a little bit more evidence of a labor shortage, but again, those data points were preliminary. I also want to point out that most of the growth here is in the service providing industries. So a couple things could be going on here. This is not weighted by the number of workers who work in any given sector. This is just kind of across all sectors, how are wages growing. So it could be the case, for example, that we have one sector that doesn't employ very many people, but wage growth has been pretty rapid. So that can tick up in the service providing sectors, for example, and make it look pretty high, even though it may be the case that there aren't that many workers in that sector. Another thing that could be happening with the wage growth in the service providing sectors is if some of these sectors are paying lower wages, even a small increase looks like a large percentage point increase. So this can also be kind of a low base dynamic that's happening here and showing the wage growth in the service providing sectors. So we're hearing a lot about employers struggling to find workers, and I believe they're anecdotes. But I'm also curious as to kind of why we aren't seeing more evidence of this kind of severe and immediate labor shortage that seems to be on the tip of a lot of people's tongue. And what I'm suspicious of is that it has to do with labor force participation. So here you see kind of a long-run trend of a decline in the labor force participation rate in Wisconsin, and that's partly to do with our aging demographic. So Wisconsin's getting a little older, so we have some people who aren't participating in the labor force anymore. But what I want to draw attention to is this last little uptick in the last kind of 2 years, maybe 2016, 2017. And I'm suspicious that what's going on there is that we had a lot of people leave the labor force during the recession. You see kind of an accelerated decline in 2009. So we did have people retiring of retirement age. But I think we also had some people who were discouraged, who retired early. We had some students go back to school perhaps because their employment prospects weren't great. And we're starting to see those people trickle back into the labor force. And I think that that's taking some of the pressure off perhaps, and maybe why we're not seeing more economic evidence of a labor shortage. So again, the evidence, I would say, of a severe labor shortage is relatively modest or weak, but I would say the labor market's gotten quite tight. These huge pools of unused labor that existed during the recession have mostly gone away. We have almost a one-to-one match between unemployed workers and job openings. I do, however, think that there's potential for a more serious shortage in the future. And just the Wall Street Journal, they released their kind of forecast based on the year. Economists are saying we don't really see signs of a slowing economy in the next year. So should there be growing labor demand, combined with a large wave of retirements, Wisconsin, like the rest of the country, is getting a little older, and given our low in-migration, I think we could see these factors kind of combine for a more serious situation. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So many Wisconsin residents are nearing retirement. So here's some demographic information. Population share by age group was in Wisconsin from the census 2010. This is from the Applied Pop Lab in Wisconsin, or at UW, excuse me. And then the population share by age in Wisconsin projected for 2040. And I want to draw attention to the 65 and over in green. And you see that that's grown by just over 10 percentage points during this 30-year period based on the projections. So Wisconsin has more and more people kind of in the post-working age, potentially. And then a smaller group in our prime working age, from 18 to 64. So these factors, I think, should we be unable to replace those workers, could create additional problems in the labor market. Especially in some sectors. So this is a good opportunity, I think, to point out that I'm using Wisconsin kind of the big picture, that I am not looking at specific industries or places for the most part, but it could be this case that we have specific regions or even specific sectors that are going to be more vulnerable or actually be feeling a labor shortage more than others. And you see that start to show up here, that manufacturing, for example, has the largest number of workers age 55 and older that are going to be potentially feeling this wave of retirements more severely than other sectors. So something to be aware of, that this is going to vary across the state and across the economy. So I want to start with a little good news when we're talking about migration. Out-migration is low, and that's good. This is not necessarily meant to be a value judgment, just in terms of if the objective is to consider the size of the workforce, if in fact we do need more workers, having low out-migration is good. And I have their rank here down at the bottom, 49, 45, Wisconsin 39. So we're already kind of below average in terms of people leaving the state. People aren't really leaving at exceptional rates. We're already in the bottom half. So I would say out-migration is low, and that's good. If people can come to, once we get people to Wisconsin, they're not leaving at exceptionally high rates. We're actually quite good at retaining the people we have. So that's the good news. The problem, though, is that in-migration is low. And I say, again, that's bad in terms of if we're considering the size of the labor force and we're trying to grow the number of workers we have in the state. With the large wave of retirements, one source of workers could be in-migration. But what you're seeing here is that not only is this not just a Wisconsin problem, this is a Midwest problem. That by rank, 42, 51, 44, Wisconsin at 45. The Midwestern states are some of the least popular destinations in the United States. So really low in-migration of our kind of prime working age, people with a bachelor's degree or higher. So thinking about in-migration, I think, potentially could be a useful policy option. So what if in-migration were higher? I think a lot of times when I hear people talking about migration and they see people leaving the state, they say, oh, we have a brain drain problem. I would push back on that. I'm not sure that we do have a brain drain problem based on people leaving the state at relatively low rates. What I think is more likely the case is that we have a brain gain problem. So this is the case where we just don't have people coming into the state as high as maybe we would like if we were to grow the labor force. So what I've done here is just give a little hypothetical to cement ideas. The dark blue line shows our actual in-migration. If that were to increase even to the median in-migration state across 50 states, we would have positive net migration. So that's different here where we have negative net migration shown in red. So even just with median in migration, we would have positive on net migration. Just something to think about. All right. So policy options for a labor quantity issue. I stay away from shortage just because it already takes that language takes the perspective of employers, but a shortage can actually be good for workers. So what's a problem for one side of the labor market is potentially good for the other side of the labor market. So I like to use the word, or use the phrasing of a quantity issue. So what are policies for increasing the pool of workers? Some things that have come up are looking at mothers of young children. We know that when mothers of young children have access to childcare, either through formal childcare centers or even having a close family member nearby, that their labor force participation increases. They're more likely to stay at work, more likely to stay in the labor force, more likely to work full time. So I think this is a potential pool of workers that could be looked at. Previously incarcerated, here's another pool of workers that could be aided into getting back into the labor force. Low-income and low-skilled workers, and we're going to hear about more of these, hear about these groups more from our other speakers. In migration, attracting new workers into the state with placemaking. I'll talk about a little bit about Indiana and their Regional Cities Initiative. They've really thought about kind of what is attractive to millennials, what is attractive to working age populations, and how do we implement those policies here. Immigration, again, that can be a source of way to increase the labor pool. And then automation. Automation, I think we don't fully understand how that's going to affect the labor market yet. But in a scenario where we don't have enough workers, I think there's potential that automation could alleviate some of that strain on employers. That's one potential effect. So I kind of anticipate the question, if in fact we're not seeing a severe and immediate labor shortage, we have a pretty tight labor market, then what is going on? Why are we hearing about employers struggling to find workers so much? And I think there could be, at least in some cases, two other potential explanations. So one of them is skill mismatch. So this means that in fact, let's say we do have enough workers, but they're not appropriately skilled, so they still can't fill the positions we have. So that would be a skill mismatch. A spatial mismatch. It could be the case that most of our openings in the state are in a different place than where our unemployed workers are. So if there's a spatial mismatch and those workers can't get to work, that's also going to lead to some unfilled positions. So I think these are two other explanations that could be going on in Wisconsin that might be part of why we're hearing about workers or employers unable to find workers. So here I'm giving a little bit of information about the skill mismatch. What I'm showing you is that over 50% of projected job growth from 2014 to 2024 is at the high school diploma or equivalent or no formal education requirement at all. So less than half of our workers need a degree. And what I'm hearing is that this need for workers kind of at the lower end of the skill distribution is in fact where most employers are experiencing the labor shortage. So last week, for example, I had the chance to sit at a table with manufacturers, specifically food processors. And what I was hearing anecdotally from them is we can find people with bachelor's degrees. We're not struggling to find workers to fill those positions. We need entry-level people. We need people who are earning $10, $12 an hour. So it does seem to be the case that the shortage is more occurring at the lower end of the skill distribution. The spatial mismatch. Again, this can be a rural or urban issue. So it could be the case, for example, historically there's been some evidence, for example, that we had unemployment in Milwaukee, but job openings outside of these kind of urban areas. And it's really expensive to commute. We either need wages that are going to offset those commuting costs, or we need public transportation or something to that effect to help those workers get to work. Sometimes housing can be an issue if it's the case that it's difficult to move. Moving is expensive, but it also depends on there being available housing in the communities where we need jobs. So all of these issues can combine. It's also the case that in rural settings, if you have a large employer in a rural setting, because of the low density of population, they're probably going to have to pull from a really large area to get all of the employees that they need. So again, having the transportation, is it the case that these wages are going to be high enough to offset the commute, the gas, the wear and tear on the car, that kind of thing. So these can all add a little bit of challenge into finding matches in the labor market. So the spatial mismatch can also be an important factor when we're thinking about kind of why are these jobs going unfilled. So policy options for a labor quality issue. I think it's possible to think about shifting the industrial composition. Where do we have jobs? It seems to be the case that we have workers kind of at the higher end of the skill distribution, maybe a little bit of a skill surplus at the high end of the distribution, whereas the shortage is at the low end. So maybe we need to think about shifting industrial composition so that we have jobs for our high skill folks who seem to be the ones in surplus right now. I mentioned Indiana. This is something that I've kind of only seen from the 30,000-foot view. They have a regional cities initiative that I think has some merit. It's about bringing communities together in economic development. There's more to be gained by having neighbors cooperate than by compete. Again, they've thought about kind of what industries they want to attract. They've thought about what's attractive to the population of workers they're trying to attract, and implementing the policies to reflect that so they can get some more people into their state. Entrepreneurship, I do a lot of research on entrepreneurship, so I think it's the case that we could encourage our entrepreneurs to create jobs for themselves, particularly those folks with a bachelor's degree. That seems to be kind of an entrepreneurial sweet spot. These are the people who are most likely to create jobs for themselves and maybe eventually others. So thinking about what we can do to foster entrepreneurship as a way to increase the industrial diversity in the state, as well as create jobs for these people, potentially all ends of the skill distribution. So just a couple key takeaways. Again, from my perspective, based on what I see in the data, I would say that the labor market is tight. There's not a lot of unused labor available for employers, but I'm not seeing signs, again, of a severe and immediate labor shortage yet. I think there's potential. Should there be an increasing labor demand combined with our aging demographic and low in-migration, I think that this could evolve into a more serious situation. Policies for a labor quantity issue, these suggestions that I had focused on expanding the pool of workers. That was where the young mothers, low income, previously incarcerated, what can we do to get these folks back into the labor force? And then policies for a labor quality issue. A lot of these strategies are going to focus on business development, and are we getting the kind of businesses in the state that are going to provide jobs to our residents and at the skill levels that they have? All right, thank you for your time.